Once again, we are traveling back in time to take a look at one of the most disliked smartphones ever made. In this video, I want to talk about what this device is all about, what went wrong with it, and what it's actually like to use in 2024. Let's jump right in. This right here is the Red Hydrogen 1, which you can currently buy on eBay right now for $120. Considering how much these were going for back in the day, this might not be crazy in the scheme of enthusiast novelty pickups, but we'll jump back to value a little later on in the video. First, a little context on this phone, which comes from Red, as in the company that makes these fancy high-resolution video cameras that cost thousands and thousands of dollars. Inside that dense metallic brick packs lots of cutting-edge technology to produce the beautiful looking images behind hundreds of Hollywood films and TV shows, including ones you're likely familiar with. However, most famously in our world here on Tech YouTube, Marquez, or MKBHD, pretty much shot everything on Red and still kinda does today. We here at Overclock Media even used this Red right here for a couple of years as the primary camera on the Austin Evans channel. But admittedly, more than anything else, owning one of these cameras for your production was absolutely a flex. When you saw one on set, not only did it mean you were cool, but also that you meant business. In many ways, Red was like the Lamborghini of the filmmaking world, and even had the high price tags to back it up. But right at the height of this cinema camera company's success, who again really only had experience selling $50,000 cameras to professionals in the entertainment industry, they had decided that they also had what it takes to release a smartphone for the masses. And thus, the Red Hydrogen 1 was born. Now this phone, again, you can buy it on eBay for about $120. But back in the day, this retailed for about $1,300, which was absolutely insane, especially when you consider that the flagship iPhone of the time, the XS Max, retailed for $1,100. So it's not a particularly great start when Red's first and only unproven smartphone was more expensive than mainstay products. And this is not even mentioning the fact that there was a more expensive titanium version, which went for $1,600. Holy shit. Now, compared to this iPhone XS, the build quality on the Red Hydrogen 1 feels absolutely solid. I mean, go figure when this whole thing is made out of machined aluminum and even has some unique design quirks to it. For example, you have these ribbed ridges on the side, which give your fingers a really nice place to rest. This helps add grip when you are holding the phone, especially with one hand. And there's just a lot of textures going on here in general that help add to that confident, inspiring feel. You have more ribbed aluminum on the back, some grippy carbon fiber-like material over here as well by the camera. And yeah, this whole thing just feels like a huge chunk of metal, just like the Red camera that it takes design cues from. Also, as a bit of an aside, if you guys didn't already know, the guy that founded Red also was the founder of the apparel brand Oakley. And if there's anything that these two names have in common, it's that all of the products under them are super manly and all look like weapons of mass destruction. Now, some might argue that this design scheme might seem a bit tacky, but there is a bit of a boyish part of me that absolutely loves this thing purely on the design cues alone. It actually kind of looks badass. Let me know if you think the same way in the comments below. Now, actually turn the Hydrogen 1 on, and you'll find that it is basically a normal Android phone, at least at face value. In terms of specs, it was running flagship stuff for the time, albeit maybe a generation older for when this came out. That's a Snapdragon 835 with 6 gigs of RAM. And back then it was more than competent. And even now in 2024, it's totally fine. As a media consumption device, the Hydrogen 1 is pretty darn nice. I do love the fact that the screen is 16:9, so for most content, especially on YouTube, you won't get any letterboxing, which is cool. And if I remember correctly, the speakers on this thing were actually solid.
Statistically speaking, at least half of you are probably watching this very video right now on a phone.
I am past Ken. That was a stupid joke, I'm sorry. Albeit there is some distortion at higher volumes, I do like that the speakers are in the bezels on both left and right so that there's stereo sound coming right at you. However, for me, I think the spec that actually aged the best has to be the battery life. With a 4,500 milliamp hour cell in here, it actually is pretty up to par with today's phones. And in the scheme of something coming from 2018, it absolutely justifies the heft of this device. It is massive, and at least for what that's worth, you do get a big battery inside of here. Most of the stuff that I just talked about, like the SoC, the RAM, battery life, and even the speakers, are all normal phone stuff, if I'm being honest. But what really makes the Red Hydrogen one unique has to be this screen. Of course, we just watched normal content on here, but this 5.7-inch 1440p display has a party trick up its sleeve. And that's the fact that it can play 3D content. Now, upon hearing that, some of you might be wondering, how does one get 3D content on this phone in the first place? Back when this phone came out, there were a couple of ways to actually get content that supported this feature, though sadly, because this phone has been long out of support, these services don't really exist anymore. But thankfully, there were a bunch of videos and pictures on here that were preloaded, presumably to at least demo all of this stuff. Opening up the Red Player app gives us all of these assets, and I'm gonna take a look at this photo of a frog, which looks like it would have decent depth information there. And yeah, there is a 3D depth effect, especially when I start tilting and panning the phone. You know what? I must say that this 3D effect is not as bad as I remember it being. Now, that's not to say it's perfect. It's actually quite far from that. If you move the phone around a lot, if you start pitching it left and right, you do start to hit the limitations of how the 3D layer is on this IPS display. The parallax is there, but it starts to jump around a bit. And honestly, it can look very disorienting. It might even give you a headache in its worst case scenario. The best way that I'd like to describe this is actually like using a Nintendo 3DS just on steroids. I think the reason why it might work on the Nintendo a little bit better is because you're likely going to see 3D content that's animated and illustrated, where here, when it's an actual real thing, you start to hit that uncanny valley pretty quick with all of the imperfections of the 3D layering of this IPS display. Oh man, yeah, you do get a lot of that depth in there. That's so cool. It's a little tacky. Again, I don't want to oversell this, but I also don't want to sell it short either. You do get that depth effect, and it is, to a degree, impressive. Really, this is a single axis phone. You want to plant it down and not move your head around, or you're probably going to get a headache with all of the strobing. It is far from perfect. Now, looking beyond this display, you would think that Red, being a camera company, that it would include a competent set of cameras as well. Sadly, that didn't really pan out either. The photos and videos on here are just kind of whatever, which is unfortunate considering that Red is particularly known for their clean images and excellent color science. None of that translates over into these rear-facing cameras, though they do allow you to shoot in H.265 and at 100 megabit data rate, which was a lot better than most other phones at the time. Camera quality and resolution aside, this system is actually set up to also shoot photos and videos in 3D to also take advantage of this 3D display. However, because the camera quality is subpar and outside of the novelty aspect of it, the 3D screen also isn't amazing, I can't imagine anyone would want to really shoot 3D photos and videos on this all that often, but at least they drove the whole ethos of this phone home, for what it's worth. All right, so far with this Red Hydrogen one, the specs were actually kind of decent. The 3D display was hit and miss, but for the sake of novelty is pretty fun. And the cameras are kind of whatever. But the last piece of the puzzle that really makes this a Red phone, and really where all of the potential lied, was with these gold connectors on the back. Looking back at when Red first announced the Hydrogen One, they had actually promised a whole ecosystem of add-on accessories that would connect via these pogo pins on the back to maximize the potential of this $1,300 device. In fact, as someone that has shot on Red a lot here at Overclock Media, this is something that I'm really familiar with since it's how Reds are actually configured. There are pogo pins on the side, top, bottom, all over the camera to configure it any way you want and to use it with Red's ecosystem of accessories. Now, I'm not implying that a lot of the stuff that works with the actual camera will work on the phone, but there was potential for things like an add-on camera attachment that would allow for interchangeable lenses that would outpower what they included on the phone itself, as well as maybe an extended battery module if you were shooting photos with this for an extended period of time, and maybe even something that would allow me to use the excellent screen on this phone as a monitor for my Red camera. But sadly, none of that ever came to fruition, and that's because this phone was pretty much dead on arrival. Which is a shame because I spent $1,300 on the Austin Evans credit card and we didn't really get much out of it apart from a video. It's a real shame. It's very easy to say that the Hydrogen One was destined to fail from the get-go, entering into a very competitive smartphone space, but I think it truly failed because it couldn't quite figure out its audience. I remember back in the day, Austin Evans and I actually went to an event for this phone a couple of weeks before launch, and it was very bizarre, mainly because we were probably the only tech-focused people there. There were no tech publications, no journalists, or other tech YouTubers to be seen. But rather, we were invited to this pretty big warehouse venue filled with Hollywood DPs, directors, execs, and actors to celebrate this phone, mingle around, and try out the demo behind closed doors. And back then, I'll tell you, granted it was pre-release, this thing was hot garbage. This event that was void of tech reviewers or people in general that could relay useful information about this device to the general public, as well as the polarizing design of this phone and the brand behind it, were heavy indicators that it was targeted towards entertainment industry people over the mainstream crowd. But it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that Hollywood filmmakers are a hyper-specific demographic of people in the scheme of overall smartphone users. And even so, it's kind of baffling that there wasn't a bigger emphasis on delivering the features that their core customers were expecting. But ultimately, they were never able to deliver on the full potential of what a Red phone could and should be. Now, this is gonna sound a bit anecdotal, but I think the failure of the Red Hydrogen One could have also played a hand in the company's eventual decline. After all, designing and manufacturing a smartphone isn't easy, especially for a company that hasn't done it before. You gotta wonder if the time and resources they put into this product could have been better spent on, I don't know, making better cameras? Ultimately, while Red is still kicking around in the film industry, it doesn't quite have the hold on the market like it did 6 or 7 years ago. These days, you see a majority of stuff shot on Sony cameras, the Ari Alexa, and actually, Red just got acquired by Nikon, of all companies. It is very harsh to say, but perhaps if they kept their focus and stayed in their lane, things might have been better. But at least for how things turned out today, this phone, the Hydrogen One, exists as an interesting relic of smartphone history, and for $120, it's certainly a neat enthusiast item to grab for your collection. Let me know what you think about this phone in the comments below, and otherwise, thanks for watching this video on Denki channel.